Thank you so much again, everyone, for your patience and for taking time out of your schedules to attend this session. My name is Jack. I'm a librarian here with the Sunnyvale Public Library. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this program to discuss all things lithium extraction and justice in the quest for clean energy. To present this evening, then, we have a very special guest. Dr. Chris Benner is here with us tonight. Dr. Benner is the co-author of the new book we are here to discuss, Charging Forward, Lithium Valley, Electric Vehicles, and a Just Future. He is also the chair in Global Information and Social Entrepreneurship and a professor of environmental studies and sociology at UC Santa Cruz. He currently directs the Everett Program for Technology and Social Change and the Santa Cruz Institute for Social Transformation. His research examines the relationships between technological change, regional development, and the structure of economic opportunity, focusing on regional labor markets and the transformation of work and employment. He has authored or co-authored 6 books and more than 70 journal articles, chapters, and research reports, many of which you can readily find on his website, which I'd be happy to link in the chat for those that are interested in learning more. So, before I have Dr. Benner properly introduce himself, once again, we do ask that you turn off your cameras and mute yourself during the presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to place them into the chat, and we will make sure to attend to those towards the end of the talk. With that, Dr. Benner, I will let you take it from here whenever you are ready.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack. And thank you all for spending some of your valuable time on a Thursday night hearing about this research. I hope to keep it entertaining, engaging, informative, and really hope that you'll put questions in the chat and then we can have a bit of a dialogue going forward around what I think are really timely issues and probably even more timely now than when we released this book in October of 2020 before the current administration. And is that showing okay, Jack, or everyone? We'll assume
Yes.
it is. Great. Um, so that's the book title. And first, a little bit about the context, which probably won't be a surprise to anyone here about kind of why this is important. But climate change is real, whether you believe it or not. The global temperatures on average are going up pretty dramatically, caused by human activity, fossil fuels. And one of the aspects of that is that we are moving from oil extraction to mineral extraction. In the process of trying to build out renewable energy and particularly electric vehicle production, there is an increased demand for minerals. Materially, it's actually less than the full weight and quantity of materials in an oil-based economy. But as we're really trying to shift to a carbon neutral economy, we're going to see increasing sites of mineral extraction. That includes lithium. It includes a lot of other valuable minerals too. I mean, this is a chart just showing predictions of the global market of energy transition materials. It includes cobalt, graphite, lithium, nickel, rare earths, all that are going into batteries and electric vehicles. And particularly copper is the large one that goes into uh, automobiles, electric vehicles. And really the key question that we're asking in this book, and that I think is really important, is will those sites of mineral extraction be sacrifice zones? That's what we know from a lot of experience of mineral extraction around the globe is that the communities in those places tend to be subject to lots of environmental damage, and in opposition to what some people say of like, oh, it's an economic benefit, in many, many cases, there's actually what we often call a resource curse. These industries tend to be very capital intensive, so there's not a lot of jobs. They tend to, in part because of the capital intensivity and the technological sophistication required, tend to be dominated by large multinational firms in the global north. Many of these sites are in the global south with historic economies dominated by export agriculture, colonial history there, and so have a very hard time having domestic leadership in that, although that is shifting. And they can tend to distort economic patterns in the state in complex ways. But the question is, can you return resource curses into a resource benefit. And there are examples around the globe. Norway is one of them where resources have been a tremendous boon. And part of what we're trying to understand in the case of lithium is where and how might that happen. Now, why is lithium particularly important? It is the most important element in energy storage in our current dominant battery energy systems. That's true in electric vehicles. It's true in our electronic devices. It is still true in battery energy storage systems. Although there are some interesting new technologies that are emerging that might, over time, replace lithium ion batteries. And we can talk more about that. Sodium is a much cheaper material, isn't as energy dense as lithium, but can be used in energy storage systems pretty effectively. But there are real questions about how lithium is uh, extracted from the earth. It's pretty widespread mineral, and it's in our oceans, it's in most of our waters. But at the level where it is commercially viable, is much less. Australia is the dominant source of lithium in the world today. About half the world's lithium comes from hard rock mining in Australia that looks like this. And, it's typically destructive, tearing up the earth, pulling out large quantities of hard rock and crushing it down and through a variety of processes using acids and other methods getting out the lithium. The other major way that we get lithium in the world today is in Chile and Argentina. And it's these large evaporation ponds. So there are brines that have concentrations of lithium in them under the ground that are brought to the surface, put in these large pools. The water is evaporated off. The lithium becomes more concentrated in the material left behind, which makes it easier then to extract for commercial value. But and that is less energy intensive, less environmentally destructive than the hard rock mining, but uses tremendous amounts of land and wastes a lot of water. The water gets evaporated off, and even though it's salty water, brine, it is also affecting the freshwater aquifers in these high desert, very dry regions of Chile and Argentina. So there's pretty intense opposition to these expansion of these lithium mines, mostly from indigenous communities in Argentina and Chile, although that's also a complicated story. So the story that we're looking at in this book is in the Salton Sea known geothermal resource in Imperial County. For people who don't know, it's a far southeast corner of California, where there is what some people have called the cleanest, greenest lithium on the planet. It's a place where the lithium is contained in very, very hot brine that is 5 to 8,000 feet below the surface of the earth. Currently, that brine is brought to the surface in 11 different geothermal plants. So you're producing renewable energy already in this area of California. And the proposal and plans moving forward and investing moving forward is to attach lithium extraction using a new technology called DLE or direct lithium extraction that will bring the hot water, the hot brine up, run the turbines for the geothermal energy, and then attach onto it these direct lithium extraction plants that will then extract the lithium and then re-inject the brine back into the deep underground aquifer. The brine is already in this closed loop system. It's just adding on this direct lithium extraction. There's enough lithium in this geothermal resource to replace the entire automobile fleet of the United States with electric vehicles. It's 350 million vehicles or batteries worth of lithium, billions and billions and billions of dollars. So there's a lot of interest in that. But the interest and why it's called Lithium Valley is because, of course, if you want to attract capital to a new place investment, you've got to name it Valley something after Silicon Valley. But there is some, I think, depth behind the vision that they're trying to create there, which is that it's not just this site of extraction, not just feeding into a resource curse, but a site of job creation. And the vision is to add manufacturing of value added materials to the lithium battery supply chain. So you turn lithium into cathode active materials. That's one of the um, polarizations of a lithium battery. The other is the anode. And then you could actually eventually perhaps manufacture batteries or even electric vehicles in this location. And there's a bunch of reasons why it might be more valuable to do that. So that's the vision is clean, green, renewable energy tied to direct lithium extraction with a whole bunch of jobs connected to it in this sector of the industry. And part of what our book is really trying to ask is how likely is that possible? What are the issues at stake? What should we be looking at in this kind of micro case study that might help us understand this transition from oil extraction to mineral extraction more generally for a just transition going forward? And the history of the Salton Sea is a fascinating story. The book is actually written with a lot of characters and stories. And the one thing I'd leave in your mind across this is sort of a continuity of schemes and scoundrels, people who have periodically provided promises of a different and better future for the region, then made their millions or made their money and left. And so that's one of the fears and skeptics, reasons for skepticism that people in the region have at the moment for the promise of Lithium Valley. But first, a little bit of the background. Why is there lithium here? Well, part of it is that the Colorado River, for 50 million years, as it was carving out the Grand Canyon, periodically ended in what was called the Salton Sink at that time. River deltas meander if they're not dammed. Sometimes it would flow into the Gulf of California. Other times it would flow into the Salton Sink and create big lakes in that area. And the most recent was called the ancient Lake Cahuilla. And you deposit salts that includes lithium in the rock that build up over time and harden, and then those get buried and end up deep down near the geothermal energy sources that heat the brine and bring it to the surface. Um, Native peoples have lived there for at least 8 to 10,000 years of documented settlement in the area. And they adjusted over time because sometimes the lake would be there, there'd be fresh water coming in, lots of fish, lots of birds. Other times the river would be flowing out to the Gulf and the lake would dry up over time. And then much of their lifestyles was in the surrounding hills where there's other food for forage and cultivation. And it's important, I'll just name it now, that the tribes in the area have a very different approach to lithium and the potential for lithium. The Torres Martinez tribe of Desert Cahuilla Indians have been exploring and very open to job opportunities and really ownership opportunities with value added operations connected to lithium. The Kumeyaay and the Quechan to the east are pretty opposed to expanding production in the area, concerned about traditional resources in the area, sacred sites, and really skeptical about any economic benefits from it. But the modern Salton Sea, which is the largest lake in California, was created in 1905. There's a very interesting story about the California Development Corporation, a bunch of people who were trying to build out agriculture in this region. It's very good soil. Think of it like the Central Valley of California, because it was the river delta there for millions of years. But there was no water. It's a desert. And one of the things they did is renamed the Colorado Desert to Imperial Valley because that would attract more investment into that area. But then they had to figure out how to get water into the area. And so they were busy negotiating with the federal government about bringing canaled water in from the Colorado River into the Imperial Valley. But that became challenging because if that water is navigable, the federal government owns the water. So what they ended up doing was negotiating with the dictator in Mexico at the time, Porfirio Diaz, to build a canal that started on the Mexico side. It was a combination of constructed canal and old riverbeds that flow north into the Salton Sea. And the water became owned by a division of the California Development Corporation in Mexico. So when it came into the US, it was private property. And so they could own it and didn't have to negotiate with the federal government about that. Schemes and scoundrels. Because they didn't construct the canal very well during a flood during that year in 1905. The canal broke, and then essentially the whole Colorado River flowed into the Salton Sea for 2 whole years until they could get it with the help of the Southern Pacific Railway Company to stop the water flowing in. But that created the modern agriculture industry in Imperial Valley. It is the site today of almost all of our winter lettuce. It's a major production site for alfalfa, other winter vegetable crops as well. And lots of immigrant labor and low-wage labor connected with farm working, you can imagine. There was a period of time, though, in the 50s and 60s where the Salton Sea was really a booming hub of tourism activity. Investment in a major marina in North Shore. It was actually the largest marina in California at one point. There was clearly mob involvement in it. There's a story about that in the book. There were investment sites to try and sell housing and connected to major employment sectors, scoundrels, and schemes, key part of it. And that went on for about 10, 15 years. It became a major site for Hollywood. Frank Sinatra would vacation there. The Beach Boys performed there. Became a major destination site. But then, combination of a number of things. One is the sea got more and more salty. You're talking about water coming in, evaporating off. Of course, it's going to turn into a salt lake. And more efficient irrigation combined with negotiations around Colorado River water meant that less water was coming into the Salton Sea itself. Um, Tremendous die-off of fish in the area, literally millions of fish a day dying off in some periods of time from algae blooms and toxic. Imagine the agricultural runoff now of over 120 years and the toxic phosphorus and others connected with that. And then also as the water level dropped, it opens up these beachfront playas, they call it, which have very fine dust, sand on them. When wind comes in, it creates these incredible dust storms, some of the worst air quality in the country, asthma rates that are 2 to 3 times the average rates in the country. So this has been called the worst environmental disaster in California's history. I think without a whole lot of hyperbole, that's probably arguable. It's also a very poor region. On the far right there is the median household income in Imperial Valley in 2022, 57,000, about a third of what it is in Silicon Valley in Santa Clara County. It's a county that's now predominantly Latino. It's about 85% Latino now. It's projected to increase to about 92%. Roughly 30% of that are foreign born of the total population. 15 to 18% undocumented. So it gives you a sense of who the demographics are in the region. But one of the other dynamics in the region is that it has some of the lowest voter participation rates. And that's partially because fewer people are registered, and it's also partially because those who are registered don't vote as highly as other counties in California. And what this shows is the total votes cast in the last presidential election by county in California, and Imperial's down there, and it's about 4 out of 10 adults in the county actually vote in a typical election. And so that creates all sorts of challenges when you have a local government that is trying to pursue this issue and this industry and support it when there's a lot of concern in local communities about feeling marginalized from political processes. So that's the landscape. Into that landscape are three companies that are trying to extract lithium for mostly the electric vehicle industry. Still, about 80% of lithium goes into electric vehicle batteries, 20% roughly into battery energy storage. There's some percentage in there for our electronics, but those are really small batteries. So Berkshire Hathaway, BHE, is the big corporation in the room, owned by Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett, major multinational firm, and this is one of their operations in California. They operate 10 geothermal plants at the moment. Energy Source Minerals has ownership of one of the geothermal plants in the area, and they're focused on building out the direct lithium extraction connected to that plant. Controlled Thermal Resources is the new kid on the block. They were an Australian company, actually had some ties to the lithium industry in Australia, have relocated their headquarters to Imperial County, so is now a U.S. Corporation. And they have no geothermal plants at the moment. Their proposal is to first build the geothermal plants and then build out lithium connected to that over time. So it raises all sorts of questions about if we want to have a positive economic and social impact with the lithium industry in this area, how might you do that? What does it look like? One of the big debates had to do with an excise tax. How much should the companies be paying in tax for what they're pulling out of the ground? There was a huge battle early on. This would have been in 2020, 21, about whether it would be a percentage of revenue versus based on a volume tax, the amount of lithium you take out. The three companies were mostly in favor of, if there was going to be an excise tax, to have it be based on a percentage of revenue. But mostly the companies were opposed to an excise tax at all. They were like, why should you tax us? This is an early industry. It's just going to disincentivize development in the area. Some of it in very disrespectful ways. Some of the comments, particularly of the CEO of Controlled Thermal Resources, was pretty dismissive of the politicians who were pushing for this. The community perspective was predominantly about wanting a volume-based tax. It's very hard to actually get credible information about how much revenue companies are getting from selling their lithium. It's certainly true if it's a private company, but even with public companies, they have contracts that are long-term contracts with multiple different clients who may be paying different amounts for the lithium. And it's part of shifting risk around. And they didn't want to be transparent about how much they're actually getting from that. So this was a case where community perspectives won. The volume-based tax was passed. It runs from $400 to $800 a metric ton, and that is a sign of community power in the region. The next question becomes, well, how do you help build out the planning for the envisioned manufacturing in the region? And the idea was to put in place a programmatic EIR. There's a lot of concerns in California about the ways that the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, can slow down permitting. And if you're looking to get in outside investments for new developments, anything you can do to streamline that process can help in that. So the idea was to get an EIR for the whole project that was centered around particular types of use in different areas, so that when a battery company or other component company might come in, it's all ready to go, it's all permitted, and the approval can go through quickly. So lots of community meetings about these different land uses that are shown on this slide and how much should be devoted to conservation area or preserving agricultural land in that area, how much could be for recreation activities, and then how much for the actual manufacturing. That process is still going on. The County of Imperial may still be open to public comment on that. It was sometime this spring when the deadline was for that. But there's a whole group of community organizations that are really trying to push for clear community benefits, enforceable contracts with the companies, and that they would commit to a certain set of criteria that would be part of an envisioned agreement. And these are the priorities that this set of community groups are really pushing for clean, healthy environment. There's a lot of concerns about water use. There's concerns about additional diesel fume release from trucks coming in and out. There are some waste materials produced in the direct lithium extraction process, and some of them have lead in them, some other toxic materials. So how are you going to deal with that? Important concern about respect for the rights of indigenous peoples, and then, labor conditions, diverse, equitable, inclusive workforce, local hire, safe jobs with family sustaining wages, and then ensuring there's transparency and accountability throughout that process. What's really interesting about this local work is that it ties in very closely to some global work that's going on to try and ensure greater transparency and accountability along the whole electric vehicle battery supply chain, from mining to refining to developing that precursor and cathode active material production I mentioned, battery cells, battery packs, and through the whole recycling process. Lead the Charge is a global coalition of non-governmental organizations that have been rating electric vehicle companies, automobile companies, over the last 3 years on how transparent they are on their global supply chain and how well they meet criteria around environmental sustainability, around human rights, and around child labor issues. The European Union is going one step further, maybe 10 steps further, to actually require all batteries that are sold in the EU, the European Union, to have a battery passport that would document where all the materials come from that have gone into that battery, and what the environmental and human rights and labor conditions are in those sites of production. So it's really requiring those companies to take responsibility for that full supply chain. But one of the things that's really clear is when you have multinational companies with large scales of capital on one side and small nonprofit organizations and community organizing groups in the desperately poor circumstances that, I described at the beginning, those groups don't have a lot of power. And so even though there's this great notion of negotiating at a table around a community benefits, sometimes they have to turn to lawsuits to try and block it. And so indeed, Comité Cívico del Valle, in partnership with the Earthworks, an environmental group, brought a lawsuit against the County of Imperial that's tied to the environmental impact report that Controlled Thermal Resources put together, and that has slowed down the development process. And it's really, their effort to try and provide leverage or get leverage to push for better community benefits in the region. It's a complex industry to be trying to engage in community benefits right now, uh, in anything, because it's so volatile and shifting over time. Like many minerals, there can be boom and bust cycles in lithium. 4 or 5 years ago, the price of lithium was about $80,000 a metric ton on global markets. It dropped to $8,000 a global metric ton, so 1/10. It's now back up to 20,000 roughly a metric ton. So, that big decline in prices, well, big jump first and then a decline, affects capital markets, affects companies' ability to attract investment. One of the other things that's interesting going on is shifting markets. There has been in the US a flattening of demand for electric vehicles, actually until the very last quarter. Some of that, well, most of it has to do with the Trump administration getting rid of some of the consumer subsidies for electric vehicle purchase, and getting rid of some of the production benefits and subsidies for companies manufacturing batteries in the US as they invest again in the oil and gas industry. But the other thing is, as CTR in particular is trying to attract investment in so they can actually build out their geothermal plant and the lithium extraction, realizing that there's a new market in the world for electric power. And of course, it's data centers. And so they're really trying to market now their geothermal plant as a great place to be co-located with a data center. But there is tremendous community opposition, as I'm sure many of you are aware, to data centers coming in, and real concerns here about water use. It's, as I said, a desert. The water's coming from the Colorado River, and there's not any to spare for extra data centers. There is ways to cool the data centers that don't require as much water use, but that's another story. But I think one of the things that's really important to think about as we think about, again, how to get from a resource curse to a resource benefit is the fact that the electric vehicle market wouldn't exist without the public sector. I would say in California, it's really driven by an environmentally conscious consumer base. And Californians, we tend to care about the environment. And that is the background or support for the electric vehicle regulations that exist in California. What's gotten a lot of publicity in the last few years was the proposal, well, the regulation that required all new vehicles sold in the state to be either zero emission vehicles or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles by 2035. That date is shifting. There's some question about whether we'll meet it there. It's being challenged by the Trump administration. That really drove the market for electric vehicles in California. Tesla was the primary beneficiary of that because, of course, they were way, way, way ahead of the curve in building electric vehicles. But California's support for the electric vehicle industry goes all the way back to 1990. Our first zero emission vehicle rule was in 1990. It's a super interesting case. And there's a documentary about it that's called How GM, General Motors, Killed the Electric Vehicle. But what happened was the state said that if you want to sell internal combustion engine vehicles in California, you also have to make available electric vehicles. And so General Motors was the first one to come out with what was called the EV1. It was a lead battery electric vehicle, so not as good a performer as many of the lithium ion batteries today. And there's an argument that they built it in such a way that they actually wanted to intentionally kill the market for electric vehicles. And indeed, that ZEV rule from 1990 was shifted over time and hasn't sustained. But there have been lots of other ways the state of California has tried to support electric vehicles, one of which are these tradable ZEV credits, which enables companies to sell credits for the amount of electric vehicles they produce. And for Tesla, they have a surplus of credits because they needed a certain number. It's a little complicated to explain, but like a company like General Motors or Ford, et cetera, if they weren't meeting a quota of electric vehicle sales, had to buy these ZEV credits to make up that difference. So they were buying the ZEV credits from Tesla. And that market for these ZEV credits made up 85% of Tesla's gross margin in 2009. This was a time when it was not clear if Tesla was going to actually get into the market for electric vehicles successfully or whether it was going to go bankrupt because of all the investment they had put into place. It's kind of crazy to think about that now when we think about how big Tesla has gotten and how prominent Elon Musk is as the richest person in the world. But there was a time when that future was not at all clear and that Tesla might go into bankruptcy. And it was these ZEV credits that ensured that they have, a basic cost-free source of revenue and profits that provided as much as $1.8 billion a year by 2022. And I'll just say, I mean, that's essentially public investment creating private value. And, I think that's an appropriate and proper thing for the public sector to do is to create private value. But there should be this question of, well, what are the benefits of that? How are they distributed in a way? And in Tesla's case, it has driven the market value of Tesla. I have this figure here that in December 2023, that's an arbitrary point in time, but at that point, Tesla's market value was more than the next 9 most valuable automakers combined. And of course, that all goes into stockholders of Tesla's wealth shares. By the way, I just looked earlier today. Tesla's market value is now more than all other public automobile companies in the world combined. Now, that's a bet on their future in robots and artificial intelligence, not automobiles. But part of the point is, again, this company that could have gone bankrupt in the mid-aughts was saved in part by California's consumer conscious consumer base or environmentally conscious consumer base and these rules. But one of the things and the point about that private wealth being captured from public investment is the kind of subsidies that are there, including Department of Energy grants, the California Energy Commission grants, incentives under Biden administration policies, including the Advanced Manufacturing Production Credit. All of those are being put in place without very strong criteria about who benefits and who doesn't. Are there decent paying jobs in those places? This is a map that shows by state an Oxfam America rating of labor conditions. So it's what's the level of the minimum wage? What are the right to work legislations or not? Are there occupational health and safety regulations in place that are strong and reasonable? And the dots are new investments along the electric vehicle supply chain. And part of what you see there is they're calling it now the battery belt from Michigan down to the south. And a lot of them are in the south, where a lot of these new investments in battery and component manufacturing are going in those places that have the worst labor conditions. And then in terms of thinking about in the environment, these are places where a large part of the elected leadership of those states don't believe in climate change, or at least human caused climate change. And yet they're very willing and happy to accept subsidies and investments in their state that are driven by a concern for environmental sustainability and countering climate change. So, that's the context, and I think it raises a question about the future for, the Lithium Valley, for the U.S. and the world. I think hopefully we are moving away from that oil past, and there's a lot of reasons why renewable energy has reached a point where the basic market mechanics have taken over, and renewable energy is actually cheaper than nearly all non-renewable sources of energy at the moment. And so we're seeing, net increases of energy demand around the globe actually being captured 100% and more by the growth of renewable energies. And we're beginning to see an electric vehicle industry around the globe that is really taking off. Already in China, over half of the cars that are sold are electric vehicles. In Europe, double-digit growth a year as well. So I think the transition will happen. There's a question about how fast and where, but I think the question that's important connected to that is who benefits from that and who doesn't. And I hope the story of Lithium Valley, which is really about how do we understand community perspectives, how do we support and understand community benefits and values in this complex relationship with a rapidly changing industry, and that can provide lessons for the rest of the world. So if you're interested in that story, there is a website, chargingforwardbook.org, where you can order the book. There's also several videos, including a PBS half-hour video that was done on the Lithium Valley, largely based on our book. And feel free to reach out to me at any point. I'm a professor at UC Santa Cruz, as you heard, cbenner@ucsc.edu. And with that, I'll stop and hopefully take some questions and hear what's on your mind.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation. It was a treat to have you with us tonight. Quite illuminating, and I encourage people to participate in the chat if you have any questions. I do have a couple things to ask, maybe get the ball rolling, if you'd like to start out that way, Chris.
Sure.
I guess what really captured me about the book in the first place was this idea of balancing uh, urgency, I guess, with equity. So, you talked about this state pressure to deploy electric vehicles and to scale up the battery storage, to meet climate deadlines. But how do we balance this environmental urgency with this kind of more deliberate, slow-moving work of community engagement and environmental justice, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And one of the ways we think about that is, the speed of trust versus the speed of the market. And trust takes a long time to build, especially in a context like this where there's this history of broken promises and schemers and scoundrels um, coming in. And I think there's no substitute for that. But part of what we try and say in the book is that the urgency of climate change is such that we need these large multinational corporations. We need the capital that they have access to. We need the technical expertise they have to bring, hot brine out of 8,000 feet below the surface, the complexities of direct lithium extraction. And so a lot of the community and environmental justice groups can get into a very oppositional framework and understandably so because of kind of some of the dynamics I talked about. But on their side, I think it's a challenge then to move to this sense of, yeah, we actually need this. And even though there may be some things they don't get locally, to try and put it in a broader context. I mean, if we can get lithium from geothermal brines rather than hard rock mining in Thacker Pass in northern Nevada, that's another big site that's going on in that area. That's hard rock mining with all the environmental problems in the area. It's heavily opposed by native tribes in the area and most environmental groups. That's better if we can get renewable energy linked brine from Lithium Valley. So it requires a shift on that side. But on the state side and the corporation side, um, there's kind of a stick and a carrot approach. I think, part of the stick is a recognition that even small, little, powerful community groups in California have some levers, right? And a lot of that's through the courts, and they're clearly exercising it. And it's in the company's interests to maintain those relationships and build those relationships just to avoid the slowdown of the production because they're looking at trying to build lithium that's competing with other sources of lithium around the globe. And in the long term, 20, 30 years, maybe a shift away from lithium to other technologies. But then I think there are ways that the state can really help. And I think where consumers can really help. One of the things we'd love to see in California is maybe a state level equivalent to the European battery passport. If you want to sell an electric vehicle in California, you got to label your battery so we understand the supply chain and what are the human rights and environmental conditions along that supply chain. I think I'm not a lawyer, but I think we have the right to do that. It's a question of whether we have the political will to make that happen. And what that could do is again accelerate a transition to a more just uh, transition. Because if you could document, oh, here's lithium that's coming from the Imperial Valley produced with geothermal energy, rather than hard rock mining in Nevada or hard rock mining in Australia with all the energy and environmental problems with that, it could shift more rapidly. So, I think it just requires an understanding of the whole context on all sides, and yeah, some shifting of long-held positions. So I say just, it's not easy, but I think the path forward are there.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how, the struggle in Lithium Valley kind of acts as a real world test for this idea of, solidarity economics. But it
Mhm.
seems like you kind of touched on that already. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, Kind of shifting towards, this idea of lithium extraction. I had a question about that, but I know that someone in the chat, Christina in the chat, has a similar question, to which I was going to ask. She says, on the spectrum of hydrocarbons slash plastic to bauxite slash aluminum, where are we at with lithium recycling right now? And do we have good numbers on how much demand could be met without ramping up extraction?
Um, it's a really, really, really good question. One of the beautiful things about lithium batteries, in opposition or in contrast to coal and gas, when you burn coal and gas, it's gone, right? Its materials are out in the atmosphere. It takes millions of years to recreate it. With a battery, you're just charging and it discharges and charging and discharges and charging. None of the material that's in the battery disappears. The battery itself can degrade over time. So we actually have very well developed lithium battery recycling technologies and companies growing. Redwood Materials is one of the largest in the company. They're located just over the border in Nevada, Carson Valley. And part of that is because it's close enough to the Tesla battery factory outside of Reno. In that process of creating batteries, there's actually a fair amount of waste material that gets produced that then immediately gets shipped to Redwood Materials. They crunch it up, and then there are processes that have, chemical and other ways of extracting the different resources, not just lithium, but nickel and manganese, et cetera. It's not a huge market for it at the moment, in part because, the curve of lithium ion batteries means that we're just now beginning to get to the lifetime of batteries that were in sort of the earlier um, electric vehicles. So there will be a coming greater market of car-based lithium batteries that will need to be recycled. I don't have exact figures for you on like what percentage of the materials we're capturing at the moment, because it's one thing to say, which is true, that you actually have to recycle lithium batteries from electric vehicles, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily capturing all of the materials that are there in there. Some still goes to waste. But I would say, in general, particularly compared to plastic, I think lithium batteries are much more, and maybe even beyond the aluminum end of the spectrum in terms of the recyclability of them. And I can refer you, actually, I was a graduate student I was working closely with from UC Davis. Her whole dissertation was on that topic, and I can track down that information and get it to you.
That'd be excellent.
And that's a good point, Christina. Yeah, it's much more recyclable than plastic, but fair enough. That's a very low bar. Yeah, it's much better than that.
Um, yeah, and going even a bit further, with like direct lithium extraction or from an environmental standpoint, I know that the the Salton Sea kind of operation has been described as a closed loop system. Um, can you describe how closed that is, and does it actually minimize the that surface footprint, or you know, especially at scale, will this or how will this, if exacerbate kind of this freshwater strain, or will it aggravate the region's air quality? Can you speak to any of those kind of concerns, maybe, if possible?
Yeah, I can. People call it a closed loop system because the water is re-injected into the ground. And in that sense, it's true. It's not a truly closed loop because, of course, you're extracting direct lithium. But there are many other minerals that are in the brine, some of which have commercial value, actually zinc and manganese and phosphorus. And the companies are talking about how do they extract that in ways that can have commercial value. Some of them also have to be taken out before the water goes through even the geothermal plant, but certainly in the direct lithium, silica is one where as water cools, it tends to cake, right? It hardens and cakes on materials. And that would shut down the lithium plant pretty quickly. So they actually have to, for the geothermal plants, they take out about 95, 96%, as I understand it, of the silica. For the direct lithium, they're really going to have to take out 100% to make it commercially viable. So that creates waste materials. And there's also some byproducts that come out in the process of bringing out the lithium. There's, as I mentioned, lead in there, there's cyanide in there, there's other materials. So that creates some waste stream. And that already exists in some waste from the geothermal plants, and some of it is labeled toxic in California's regulation. And because of that, goes to particular sites that can handle it. Others just go to, large landfills of it. The water itself, there is some that gets lost in the steam process that runs the turbine, but you're actually not losing a lot of the brine itself. It's just more of these hard materials that come out.
I know we're a little bit short on time, so I won't take up too much more of your time. But I do want to quickly maybe end the session with returning to this more kind of human element, more side of the book and your work. There's a concept very closely tied to your work, this idea that, we can't change I think there's a quote, we cannot change the way we deliver power until we change who wields the power. For folks on the call and for community members who are hopefully watching this recording, who want to support this idea of a just transition, but maybe feel a bit far removed from policy or, the boardroom, where is a good place to start, maybe to better educate ourselves or, where to get involved?
Well, the first place I would say is, read the book, go to the website, chargingforwardbook.org. If you only have half an hour, watch the PBS special because that'll give you a really good picture of what's going on in the area. Um, I would say keep an eye out for state legislation or other propositions that might work to support the transition. The California Energy Commission has been working very closely with local residents in the area, both to try and build up the community capacity of the nonprofit organizations, as well as local government capacity, so that they can apply more successfully to state and federal grants to invest in some of the infrastructure that's needed to build out this region. I think the idea of a California battery passport or a U.S. battery passport would be really valuable. I'm not aware of that being a viable policy option at the moment, but I think it's something we should keep thinking about. I think part of what's happened in the last 2 years, honestly, is, prior to that, there was a real sense of momentum in this industry. And, at least as long as we have a federal administration that's pretty opposed to electric vehicles. It's, for the next couple of years anyway, it's going to be trying to hold ground. But I think the market dynamics are shifting enough, certainly globally, that the transition will happen. And then the nonprofit organizations that are mentioned in the book, Earthworks is one, Comité Civico del Valle, Imperial Valley Equity and Justice is a really important one going on in the area. Jobs to Move America is working very closely in that area. The United Auto Workers actually has a center for manufacturing in the green economy. It's really interesting where you think of unions as being mostly about negotiating over the distribution of wages in an industry. The Center for Manufacturing and Green Economy is really trying to get ahead of the industry and look at how do we invest in and support their work. Those are all organizations that love donations, take support. It's worth following their work.
Chris, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. It was quite illuminating, I will say. The book again is Charging Forward, Lithium Valley, Electric Vehicles, and a Just Future. The library just purchased it. We've been having issues with our vendors, but it will be coming into the building quite soon. I do also encourage you all to view that 25-minute PBS documentary that Chris and his co-author, Manuel Pastor, were a part of, in which the documentary is based off of their book. I just put that in the chat if you guys are interested. Really succinct, very great, and kind of speaks to what the entire book is about. Um, Chris, again, thank you. I really appreciate your time, and I thank all of you for taking the time out of your schedules to attend this Zoom session. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jack, for the invitation to speak here, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your interest.